Before I start reading, because I have to write my sermons out, I am not an off-the-cuff sort of speaker, but I loved hearing Woody Guthrie this morning as some sort of circus rendition, but I loved it. I loved doing the reading about passing to the next generation. I loved the meditation. There's a lot of things that have already happened this morning that have changed my thinking about what I am about to give you. So I am going to be dealing with one super small slice of democracy. So bear with me as I take you on this super small slice of what I was thinking about when I told Jan I wanted to speak about informed citizens. So here we go. I think we all know the story of democracy, invented by the Athenians. Demo is actually not the word for people. It's actually the ancient Greek word for a neighborhood, which was the smallest voting precinct in Athens. Literally, rule by the neighborhoods, or rule by the villages. In contrast, aristocracy means rule by the best, which tells you something about who was creating terminology in 500 BCE. But citizens had a role beyond voting in Athens. They were expected to work to keep their democracy going. Each year, 500 people were chosen at random to serve the government, enforce the laws, enact the laws, and control the political process. This reminds me a lot of a lay-led congregation. And for us here, right here, we know that education about the issues and realities of our congregation is really paramount to being a good member of this church and of being a good citizen in our larger communities. Plato, you might have heard of him, was a famous hater of democracy, maintained that most voters never have enough information to cast a good vote or to be a good citizen. To him, good education was the most important feature of an ideal democracy, and he thought it wasn't really realistic to expect of most people because most people weren't educated enough to know what was going on. This is classic Plato, by the way. In what we call the Republic, right, one of his most famous works, he advocates not for a democracy, not even a republic, but for a philosopher king who will rule everything with great wisdom. Plato's work is not titled The Republic. He titled it Politeia, which means the state, or citizenship. We're a little fuzzy on which one he meant. The modern name of it is derived from the Latin title, Res Publica, which meant a public affair. Over the years, it became a false cognate, and it has given Plato this reputation as someone he was not. I doubt Plato ever actually saw a wise philosopher king in real life, based on what I know about ancient Greece, other than Socrates, maybe, who was sentenced to death by his democracy. Probably this informed a lot of Plato's bad feelings towards democracy. But Plato really wanted that person to exist. He wanted a wise philosopher to tell everyone what to do very badly. He wanted to feel like whoever was in charge was smart and cared for people. He probably wanted the demos to be smart and to care for people too. He just thought it would be easier to find one good person to be king than 1,000 people who could do it and will vote. Our founding fathers were more optimistic. Our whole system is actually predicated on this, that the people with information and education will decide and we will abide by their decision. My background is in librarianship. That is what I was trained in and I worked in for a long time. As a profession, librarians always cared a lot about creating well-informed citizens. I think of it as an investment in our business model because people who care about being informed are people who will support the existence of libraries. This sounds a little jaded, probably. It might be. But because librarians care about creating and maintaining well-informed people, and people's votes determine the types of politicians that get elected, librarians have a vested interest in helping people be better informed about their candidates and the issues those politicians will deal with. And those politicians will hopefully fund libraries because they want voters to like them. This is my simplistic business model of how libraries work and why I am a librarian and not a business major. So what does it mean to be well-informed? What does that even mean? How do libraries define this? We're sort of the experts, right? Now, by and large, public libraries offer resources for you to learn more about your candidates. They don't interfere to a very deep extent other than to point to specific resources that have been vetted as nonpartisan. You can go to any public library right now and get a lot of information about candidates and about voting. I encourage you to do that if you're not sure where to go for good information. But school libraries and university libraries take a completely different tack. Unlike public libraries that encourage information gathering, academic libraries explicitly teach users how to evaluate arguments and information. We call this information literacy. And to us, it is probably the most important skill a citizen should have. Plato didn't have a definition for this kind of skill, but he also didn't know libraries like we have today would exist, or librarians like we have today could exist. So I hope he would be pleasantly surprised. Information literacy is a set of skills that librarians assume everyone has. I think a lot of people assume everyone has, but in reality, very few people have it at a high level. The skills are cumulative. We have a list of the skills, and you develop the first before you go to the second, and the second before the third, and so on. They go like this: defining information needs, finding information, evaluating information, organizing information, using information, and using it ethically, and finally, understanding the issues around information. And I want to talk about these sort of quickly. Defining information needs, this is knowing what information you need and how much you need. This is actually a really big step. A lot of people do not know how to frame a question that they need an answer to. There's a famous story, I say famous among librarians, so obviously famous worldwide, about a user who comes into a library. They go to the reference desk, to the reference librarian, and they say, "I'm looking for a picture of a horse." The librarian says, "Okay, what sort of horse are you looking for? A color of a horse? Are you looking for a specific breed of horse?" They go on a very long conversation. It turns out the person actually wanted a picture of the Trojan horse. Framing your question is one of the most basic things that you have to do if you want the answer to your question. You have to understand what you're asking first. So that's step one. The second step is finding information, accessing information efficiently. How do you do, for instance, how do you do a really good Google search? Some people are really bad at that. Sometimes you will sit with someone doing a Google search and think, why did you pick those words? What are you doing? What are you looking for? Right? Finding it efficiently. And who do you ask for information? And how do you know they know the answer to your question? We actually build these skills over our lifetimes, right, as we get access to new kinds of information. But it's the next step behind framing a question. How do you get to the source of information quickly so you don't waste a lot of time looking for a source? Evaluating information. This is a doozy. This is it for me. This is the core of it. Critically assessing the validity of sources. To give an example of how important this is, I need to find out when corn gets planted in the spring. I don't need to know this, by the way. I already know this answer, but we're pretending I don't know when corn gets planted in the spring. I'm from Iowa, promise you, I know when it gets planted. But I happen to know a farmer, and so I think to myself, great, I have a very specific question, and I know an efficient source of information. I'll ask this farmer. The farmer confidently tells me corn is planted in April. Now I need to assess the validity of the farmer and his information. Where does this farmer live? Growing seasons are different in different areas. Is this farmer actually a corn farmer or just a regular kind of farmer? Are they passing along something they heard because he's never actually grown corn? And finally, if this farmer is indeed a corn farmer and from an area that could plant in April, are they any good at growing corn? Do their harvests turn out well, generally? When I ask these questions, I'm evaluating the validity of the source. Critiquing the source of information is, to me, the most important part of information literacy. You can't move on to the next steps if you don't understand how to criticize the information that you've been given. Organizing information is the next one. Selecting and organizing information into useful bits. To continue the corn farming analogy, which I know everyone found very compelling, if I asked 50 farmers to give me their planting schedules, I would not want to keep that in my head. First of all, I couldn't remember it. I need to know how to record it. I need to know how to remember it. I need to know how to parse it into pieces I can use, which is the next step, using information. You have to be able to apply your information to accomplish a purpose. I really hope most of us go looking for information in order to apply it for a purpose, even though I myself don't do that all the time. I was just randomly Googling how to find an old English manor house. I mean, sometimes you just want to know things and you don't want to use it for any particular purpose. But in this case, where we're talking about being a citizen, right, and being active in your democracy, you do want to be able to take information you use, you want to be able to apply it to something. If we're lucky, we can use one piece of information to inform a lot more than a single use. This is where extension of information to other questions through conjecture or supposition is really, really useful. And using information ethically is the second highest level of information literacy. It's important we get our information ethically, because we sometimes need to defend our right to know what we know. If you obtained it illegally or unethically, how and why do you know it at all? Is it for a greater good? Are you using the information to help others, or just to harm others or aggrandize yourself? And then the final top level of information literacy, which I think very few people truly have, is understanding the legal, economic, and social issues surrounding information. Most people never get to this point because it's almost a full-time job, which is why we have librarians. So by the time you get to the final step in information literacy, you should be really good at finding, understanding, synthesizing information, which should make you a better voter, right? However, there are scholars who think that being well-informed actually counterintuitively inhibits your ability to be a participant in the voting process. You know too much. During the 1800 presidential election campaign, John Adams warned people in his party's newspaper to bury their Bibles, because if Thomas Jefferson won the election, he would wage a war on religion and confiscate all of your family Bibles. This is one of our earliest examples of deliberate misinformation in a presidential election. Jefferson did not, for the record, take anyone's Bibles. But this was extremely common, and it started early, right? I mean, the election of 1800 was like, that's pretty new, right? But people were willing to use it. I think misinformation is a really common tactic in political, I don't know, just campaigns generally. But most newspapers in the 18th and 19th centuries were the only source of information on candidates, unless you happened to meet one. And they were partisan. People knew this. They read their own newspapers and despised the other guy's newspapers. This encouraged, actually, democratic participation because the newspapers treated their readers as impassioned citizens and voters, not observers of the news. People were supposed to read, and then they were supposed to act. Was it always truthful? No, but it would get you out of your chair. The Worcester Spy, a Massachusetts newspaper in 1832, said, "Go to the polls and see that your neighbor goes there, and vote for the men who have always been faithful to you and to your interests." Voter turnouts, especially in northern states like Massachusetts, reached over 80% by 1856. By the end of the 19th century, the partisanship and the lies in journalism, which we call yellow journalism, had left American voters feeling sort of exhausted, though, because it had reached this fever pitch. They weren't sure who to trust, right? They maybe couldn't trust their politicians or the other guy's politicians. They couldn't trust the news because sometimes it was lying. And voter turnout started to dip, and people thought they understood why. So Walter Williams, who you've probably never heard of, I had not heard of him before I started researching this, founded the first school of journalism in 1908 at the University of Missouri, and is generally considered the father of modern journalism education. He emphasized neutrality, fact gathering, and reporting. Ironically, the father of modern journalism, Joseph Pulitzer, who you've probably definitely heard of, was actually incredibly partisan and created a lot of the newspaper wars of the late 19th and early 20th century. Maybe you've seen Newsies. I don't know if you've seen Newsies, but Newsies is about a newspaper war. Joseph Pulitzer is one of the characters in that play. But his sensationalist journalism drove a lot of these people's desire to create neutral reporting. It's not an accident that the first school of professional journalism started in Missouri. Pulitzer made his first newspaper fortune in St. Louis and was often peddling outright lies to sell newspapers. But the growth and spread of objective, detached journalists in the 20th century might have done the job too well. By examining politicians too closely, critiquing both sides thoroughly, the press may have left voters feeling helpless or cynical regarding the election process. How do we know this? Correlation is not really causation, of course, but women, Native Americans, African Americans were all finally exercising, getting their rights to vote over the course of the 20th century. But the voting population in 1789 was 18%. Today, 75% of our total population is eligible to vote. But we had actual voter numbers skyrocketing. The percentage of active voters continued to drop precipitously throughout the 20th century. In 1996, which was the year of the lowest voter turnout in United States history, less than 50% of voting age Americans went to the polls. Then the internet exploded, as we all know, late 90s. Access to various information sources exploded. Partisanship returned in force. And in 2020, we had the highest turnout of voters since 1900 at 66%. And we have yet to see if that upward trend will continue, of course. It's counterintuitive to us that bad information leads to better voter turnout, but when you think about it, I think it actually does make sense. You become passionate when you're exposed to information that is constructed to impassion you. Both sides of the aisle do this, I know that. I don't think they do it consciously necessarily. I think both sides simply believe their own side so thoroughly, they can't see the other side. And when you can't relate to the other side, you think of them as ignorant and dangerous. You'll turn out to vote against the other side because you have been taught by your information to mistrust them, to trust your own people. So good information can sometimes lead to lowering the voter turnout because you think, well, they're the same in the end. Aren't both candidates the same? I would argue no, but that's me speaking personally. I would argue no. But information can lead to the whataboutism, right? This person says this, but this person says this. It's a very interesting counterintuitive argument. We might say, but my information is right. It might be. It might be right, but there may be nuances that you aren't getting because the information is presented to you in just the right way to evoke your indignation or your arrogance or your superiority. In fact, the person presenting the information might be presenting it that way because they too want to feel better than the other guys. Like I said, it might not be conscious. At any rate, we know that when journalism was more neutral, people stopped worrying about who was elected and voting numbers fell off. They were very well informed, but they had less fear and lost their zeal for voting. The rise in social media, misinformation, less rigor around what journalism means, people are informed, but with skewed information. It's the skills of information literacy that help us to decode what to consume and to find the biases in what we consume. How trustworthy is this source? What are their views? How are those views skewing what they think? Where did it come from? Why is it being given to me right now? Was it ethically obtained, etc.? In his book, Civil Disobedience, Thoreau, one of our faves, obviously, we love Thoreau, said, "How can a man be satisfied to enter an opinion merely and enjoy it? How can we be happy with just entering our opinion and walking away from the polls and saying, I did it?" He challenged us to do more than consume information or even to judge information. How can we simply formulate our opinions and then cast a vote without rolling up our sleeves and trying to make things better as well? Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass often cited the preamble to the Constitution to suggest that citizens, as well as the government, had a duty to make ideas reality. And I'm actually going to read the preamble, I'm sorry, in advance. We probably all know it, I hope. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Like I said before, the Founding Fathers' vision of a new national government was rooted in popular sovereignty, even though at the time they didn't understand how much more popular it could get. Right? The Constitution is clear that it's the people who establish justice. The people ensure domestic tranquility and secure the blessings of liberty. It's the citizenry who do these things, not a president, not a Congress. It's detached from the people. We do it ourselves. So like I said, in Athens, all the way back, people were expected to contribute to their society. We live in a modern world where we think that we would like to affect big changes in our governments, but it's really, really hard to get a seat at the table. So what do? Some people canvass for their favorite candidates or canvass against their least favorite candidate. We all do a lot of canvassing for our candidates, whether we're paid or not these days. I've been helping to write the postcards for You the Vote. You might be a judge for the polls. You might work at a food bank to make sure people have enough energy to care about being a citizen and voting. You might volunteer your time helping people learn to read, or lead a book club so we can get better at evaluating information. You might work with your community to make it cleaner, more beautiful through art or music or environmentalism to help people care more about protecting the communities that they're part of. There are so many ways to work towards fulfilling the preamble of the Constitution, making our citizens and our country better. Voting is one of them. Being a well-informed citizen is one of them. But rolling up our sleeves and doing the work is probably the most important thing we can do to help our democracy. And I hope we take our citizenship seriously enough to do all of them as well as we can. Thank you very much.